Everyone, welcome back to the Lookout. I'm here with Will Harling. Will Harling, welcome to the Lookout.
Hi, Zeke. It's an honor to be here with you today.
All right, I want to introduce you. I can't think of enough words to describe Will Harling, but Will and I met in 2000 at a fisheries conference in Chico, where we were talking about fire and fish. And Will and I have been talking about fire and fish ever since. And about 10 years ago, he had some money through his organization, the Mid-Klamath Watershed Council, to have my company, Deer Creek Resources, come over around Orleans and Soames Bar and Happy Camp and look at opportunities to use fire in the landscape and look for the places that we should be putting fire on the ground. And that turned into coming over and helping run the Klamath River Prescribed Fire Training Exchange, and then burning all over the place. Will and I just hung out in Nebraska for a week this spring and burned some big acreage out there of grasslands. So welcome, man.
Thanks, Zeke. Yeah, it's pretty humbling to be in our line of work, right? Of understanding fire at that landscape scale, understanding fire's effect on communities and the environment. From that perspective of something we've been doing our whole adult lives, and to kind of see us, right back in the same place where we are with the McKinney fire, at this place where there's certain times a year, no matter how many fire resources are available, there's just nothing we can do to save homes and watersheds and rivers from fire. And, I think you and I have dedicated our lives to trying to change our fire management culture, to understand that simply managing for ignitions and not thinking about fuels and not thinking about how we get frequent fire back on the landscape is just not an effective management strategy, And
we've been talking ever since we met about more fire on the landscape and getting fire, managing fires within burn scar mosaics and everything else. And then we just see the Forest Service going backwards. And so I thought, well, maybe today we can talk about kind of radically reimagining what we'd like to see things like in 10 years and 5 years even. What's the reality that we want to create? And you guys have been creating it on the Klamath. That's been inspiring for me to come over and work there. It's just like that you've kind of not taken no for an answer and pushed and pushed and pushed. And now you're putting fire on the ground in people's backyards. The lessons you guys are learning over on the Klamath about what you can do when you don't take no for an answer are important. I think the frustration is just like, well, how come we continue to go backwards at the landscape scale? And does it really matter if we're making a difference at the community scale if the Forest Service just doubles down on 100% suppression of all fires?
Absolutely. And I would say, after working on this issue for 25 years, change is primarily going to come from people, from everyday people becoming aware of what's happening around them. And I think that's what we see here on the Klamath River through decades of work, not only from the Mid-Klamath Watershed Council, but primarily from our tribal partners up and down the river, folks like Bill Tripp and Margot Robbins and Frank Lake and many other amazing people who have continually elevated, that cultural fire management paradigm that worked in this country for thousands and thousands of years, and in fact was adopted by early settlers, including ranchers and loggers. And, up until 100 years ago, or, 120 years ago, everybody used fire to manage fuels at the landscape scale. And so what's crazy to me is we act like it's so different to think about, doing large scale prescribed burns or managing wildfires for resource objectives. The fact that we've come to this place where most people are afraid of fire and don't see fire as the powerful tool that it is, I think is testament to, the investments that agencies have made, both state and federal, in characterizing fire as an enemy, when it's really one of the most powerful tools we have to manage landscapes. I think in that re-envisioning of how we get to a place where we're not losing communities every year throughout the Sierra foothills and in the Klamath Mountains and across the West. How we get to a place where we're not watching our spring salmon die before our very eyes. Hundreds of thousands of fish are belly up in the Klamath River right now because of those debris flows that originated in these fire scars from the McKinney fire and the river complex from last year on the Salmon River. Two muddy rivers just converge at the confluence of the salmon, the Klamath and the salmon, where previously the salmon was running clean and there's, 20, 30,000 salmonids there huddled into that clean water. And then a huge slug of sediment came down the salmon and they've got nowhere to go. And if you trace it back to why is that happening, you can see it's these places that we've successfully excluded fire for 20, 30, 50, 100 years. And every time we miss those fire return intervals, every time we put out that lightning fire, it just makes sure that next fire is going to be that much more severe. And so that's what we're seeing is this perfect storm of this fire exclusion, fire suppression fallacy or paradigm playing out on the landscape. And so, how do we get to a place where we are managing fire like we've managed fire in this country for thousands of years? And I think that's what I would like to talk about is that stepwise process that we've started here on the Klamath River to get to that place.
Yeah, that'd be great. So on the lookout over the past week, we've been talking a lot about the kind of landscape history in the McKinney fire area and how the checkerboard ownership patterns influence options for dealing with things at a landscape scale, conflicting objectives between federal landowners and private landowners, and just the fact that these lands around the McKinney have been picked and plucked of all the best trees for over 100 years. The high grade logging that happened in the 30s and 40s set the stage for these destructive fires in the 50s that set the stage for plantations, that set the stage for the beaver fire, and then we've got this kind of 8-year delay and then we get the same result in the haystack footprint in these 60-year-old plantations. And your whole landscape is littered with these plantations, so we've done our best to set up the exact same scenario over the entire West Coast.
Absolutely. And I think, over the past year and a half, I worked with a group of individuals, including Chris Dunn from Oregon State University, Mark Tuckman with Tuckman Geospatial, and the North Coast Resource Partnership to create a PODS layer, potential operational wildfire delineations. Basically, it's an 11 million acre map of strategic fuel breaks that goes from Siskiyou County over to Del Norte, Humboldt, down to Mendo, Sonoma, Trinity. And it was this amazing roadshow where we were going from, all the way from Sonoma up to Wairika and Siskiyou and meeting with CAL FIRE and the Forest Service. And I could see the very different cultures within CAL FIRE. You've got Marshall Tuberville down in the Sonoma area that has seen his communities burn down and has embraced prescribed fire and embraced, managing fuel breaks like there's going to be another fire and looking to those opportunities to get proactive fire on the ground.
Right. Yeah. Marshall's stated goal is to be able to burn something every day of the year. A pile, a grass unit, a brush unit. He said, if I can burn something every day of the year, I'm, successful. I'll be successful in my vision. That's the radical visioning part right there. Is like, people like that they have an idea of how we're going to get there.
Absolutely. I love Jim Carroll's, who's the state forester for Florida. When he told me, he's like, every day in Florida, we put smoke in the air, not because we need to ecologically, but because every day there's somebody moving in here from the Northeast or from someplace else thinking that they deserve smoke-free skies. And I want them to know where they're coming to, and the reality is in Florida, if you don't prescribe burn, then after 10 years, the Florida rough is so flammable, it's this ticking time bomb. And so you have to burn. And yet here in the West, because we came out of a pretty wet century, in the 1970s, 80s into one of the driest centuries on record, that can of whoop-ass was delayed, and so now we're experiencing what all that the fuels buildup is. But yeah, that culture, and that's kind of what we've been trying to do here on the Klamath, is like every time we can possibly put smoke in the air, that's what changes cultures. Is when people see the smoke and know and trust the people that are putting up that smoke, that they know what they're doing, that they're doing it for good reasons, and then it's not going to burn down their home. In fact, it's going to be what saves their home in the next wildfire.
I got to say, I feel like, my perspective on managed wildfire has changed a lot over the last 5 years, just like everyone else. And you guys are lucky in that you have this burn mosaic all around you that is now starting. You've suffered a lot in the last decade. Now you're starting to see a semblance of sanity, maybe, where like the Yeti fire can't become the next Happy Camp complex because you've got the Happy Camp complex and you've got the Slater across the way. And so that buys you guys some luxury that we are suffering our way toward in the rest of the state, but like, for years and years, I've been like, man, we got to manage more wildfire. And then watching the Bear Fire in 2020, when you guys were dealing with Slater, burn 40 miles and some 150,000 acres in a day and kill all these people in Berry Creek and take out the whole town. It's like, man, there are so many places still where that is possible, just to see that, like, man, you can be 40 miles away and 5,000 feet lower in elevation and still get fucked by a fire that started and was burning with good ecological benefits way up on top of the mountain. So that changed. I have more kind of empathy now when I hear fire managers say, like, look, we can't manage this fire because we might get a big east wind a month from now and take out Orville.
Absolutely. And I think that's where, the response to that is, let's identify the places on the landscape where we can manage wildfires with little to no risk to communities. And every new fire footprint we have makes these unique polygons on the landscape where you will get a lightning start and it will be completely surrounded by recent black. There's zero opportunity for it to.
And that's what we're going to have to push really hard, I think, here on the Plumas and the Lassen, because I'm worried that we're going to have a lightning strike out in the middle of the Dixie, and we're going to be sending heliattack or repellers or smoke jumpers out to put out a single tree surrounded by 100,000 acres of black. Public needs to know their geography, and we need to be calling the forest supervisor and saying, hey, why are you guys putting out that fire again? That's surrounded, that's 5 acres of green inside of a 200,000 acre high severity patch of the Dixie fire.
Exactly. I mean, we saw lightning starts last year, May 17th. So there was like 30 or 40 lightning starts on the Klamath National Forest starting at May 17th last year. And some of those were in places that could have easily been managed to a 5,000 or a 10 or 15,000 acre footprint. However, there's this mentality within the agency that, this is a war, number one, and that you have to conserve your troops. And part of conserving your troops for the battle ahead is putting out all the early season fires that would do ecological good so that you have full force for the middle of summer, but, I think, that philosophy just perpetuates the problem into the future. And I think really what we need to think about every time you put out a natural ignition, you owe a debt to that landscape. The managers of that landscape owe a fire debt to that place. And so we should be obligated with our taxpayer money, with the same money they use for the emergency of wildfire, to put fire back into that place during a safe time of year when we can manage it. And so if we used a quarter of the funds that we blow on suppression nationally every year to start to implement proactive solutions like that. Or another solution is in these recent massive wildfire footprints like the August complex. I know you've got some projects going on down there with some timber companies, or take the Slater fire, for instance. You have pockets of fuels that are accumulating while you still have areas of denuded fuels around there. So theoretically, you have burn units that are 500, 5,000, even 20,000 acres big that you could put fire back into after 3 to 5 or 6 years, and there's literally no risk outside of that footprint. And so,
Right.
I think really that's a
Yeah.
huge opportunity, because risk is driving the ship right now. Liability and risk are driving the ship, and we have to show how we can thread that needle with land managers and the public.
Yeah.
And
Well, those opportunities are so fleeting, like what we're 8 years out from the beaver fire, and the fire carried pretty well in a lot of that.
sometimes it's 5 years, sometimes it's 10 years that fire is, the previous fire is still stopping that subsequent fire. But pretty often after 10 years, we've lost the window. And
Right.
so that's where,
It's
we
kind of
need to
just like
start
it's
leaning
just
in
like
right after the
yeah,
fire.
it's just like building a fuel break. You get a couple years of benefit out of it, and then it needs maintenance, and it's the same with these burns. I think one interesting thing is like looking at beaver, where you've got the areas that were clear cut, salvaged, and then herbicided. It's like, well, that's a no-brainer fuel break right there, and then the Forest Service is coming in for so much heat about not doing anything in these salvage areas, and so then you've got this extreme contrast of just like complete bare earth in the industrial timberlands, and then right next door is like hundreds of tons per acre of 10-year-old broken tops and 5-6 foot tall brush. And so like what we're looking at on some of this industrial timberland, where we're putting together some projects, is like, well, how can we combine those two competing objectives? Like, hey, let's lay out our salvage logging units in a way that creates great opportunities for burning on the adjacent units that aren't going to get treated.
You can get a lot more acres treated for a lot less money if you're using those. You're not touching every inch of a landscape with a chainsaw or a feller buncher. In the Klamath Mountains, you just simply can't do that, because people would roll down the hill and end up 2 miles away at the river on the 100% slopes.
Should we look at some maps?
Let's look at some maps. I'm seeing Marble Mountain Ranch, Soames Project area.
So when you're talking about burning the Soames Project over here, we're upstream of Soames Bar. I love how you just like, oh yeah, that's my cousin's house there, third tree on the right. Shot a buck over there. All right, so we're looking at Soames Bar here, California. It's confluence of the Salmon River and the Klamath, and Will and his compadres, Kaduk tribe, bunch of people have been working for a long time to do some big projects here. And so maybe you can just talk us through a little. I can move my mouse around. You can talk a little bit about how you're looking at this big picture landscape here and thinking about how to put fire on there.
And so part of the idea with the Soames project is that by treating all the private lands, the mid-slope in holdings
down in here,
and then implementing manual mechanical thinning around on the roads and creating strategic fuel breaks, that we can then demonstrate how we can return to frequent fire on this landscape while protecting those values at risk, which include some amazing late Searle forests that weren't logged in the 50s through 80s. A lot of cultural resources. This is a heavily culturally utilized landscape. Families have been subsisting and maintaining their culture on this landscape for thousands and thousands of years. And so part of the key is also by doing these large projects and basically diffusing the fuel bomb that we see on this landscape, because it hasn't burned in 100 years, allowing those cultural practitioners the space to go back in and manage those, basket material gathering areas, those elk hunting areas, those ceremonial areas. Like I see, at the bottom of your screen is Off-Field Mountain, Ikaria Tuiship, right above Soames Bar there. Right kind of where you just had your pointer. That's actually our next large project, which is going to be roughly 12,000 acres, and it's going to set the stage for the return of one of the final ceremonies of the Pikyawish, the world renewal ceremonies of the Karuk tribe. So every year up until 1917, at the end of the world renewal ceremonies, the Fatoenan and his helpers would ignite a fire at the top of that mountain in the new moon in September, and it would broadcast out to the landscape. And so part of that, which we've learned from tribal elders, practitioners like Leif Hillman, Bill Tripp, Ron Reed, and many others, is that, part of that was by putting smoke in the river corridor, it cooled the rivers and allowed salmon to the Fall Chinook Run to come in so they could fish for them at Ishipishi Falls. But another piece of it was that, it was kind of this ripple in the system that, by putting fire in the same place every year, and sending it out to the landscape, it maintained, the grasslands, it maintained the resilience of that village site down at the river there at Katimin. So, that's one thing that I've been working hard, to support the tribe, for the past 20 years. If we can demonstrate the value of cultural fire, and I think if it's going to happen anywhere in California, it's going to happen here, right there on that mountain. If we can do that prep work to make the space for them to restore that fire ceremony, it's going to shift how people think about and use fire again. The other interesting thing I see in your map here, Zeke, is how vulnerable the community of Orleans is. We've done a ton of work. We've been preparing for that Slater type fire in Orleans for many, many years, for, over 20 years.
Yeah.
And yet the threat of, stand replacing, community replacing fire is still very real and present.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, when we look at this big picture, this mosaic, it really tells the story in this place of how fires burn out to each other and are kind of self-living. This is 20 years of fire spread. Here, red is kind of the older fires. Darker blue is the newer ones, and greens are kind of in between. When people when they start looking at this puzzle piece, then they realize they don't have to worry about a 250,000 acre fire starting in Somes Bar and burning the entire landscape.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think people understanding the fire history where they live it's as valuable as learning how to read in California. It should be something that all of us know and understand. And that map in particular that you made for us that showed the number of fire overlaps in any given place is also very crucial to understand, because we've lost that sense of what repeat fires in an area can do. It's the equivalent of weeding your garden. You don't weed your garden once in the spring and think that everything is going to come to fruition. You go back in 3 or 4 times, and then the land will bear fruit. And so it's the same thing with fire, where that second, that third, that fourth entry of fire after 5 to 10 or 15 years, all of a sudden you get back to this park-like condition where you've restored your grasslands and the understory, your standing trees are resilient, and the land is fruiting. It's feeding the animals, it's feeding the people.
Yeah. But I think when we look at the map of the Klamath and we see that mosaic and that kind of sense of safety in that puzzle work, then we look at the Central Sierra and we see, well, we're taking out such huge chunks. We got the Bear Fire here that we were talking about earlier that started up around Quincy and made this huge run down to Lake Orville and took out Berry Creek. And then we've got this big void in that landscape scale fire in the Yuba. And then we get down into the American and we've got the King Fire. And we get down here into the South Fork American and we've got the Caldor Fire, and, work our way down. We got the Tuolumne River, and they all blend together. We got this down here in the San Joaquin. We've got the the Creek Fire. We got the Rim Fire is one I was thinking of. Ferguson Fire. Like we're taking out such big chunks of our watersheds at once, and I'd start thinking like even if we did a 30,000 acre prescribed fire in the middle of this, and even if it burned hot, and we killed a lot more trees than we wanted on this 30,000 acre burn, we're going to prevent the 150,000 acre fire, right? And so there's this idea that when we do a prescribed burn, that somehow if we kill a bunch of trees, that like we really messed up. But then you look at what stops these mega fires, and it's like, man, having a 10,000 acre chunk of burn on there, instead of getting a 150,000 acre fire, you might get a 50,000 acre fire. And so I think we're kind of looking at it all wrong. If our measure of success is that areas that we've kept fire out of, it's like, well, that's not panning out, because sure as rain in Hawaii, not California, we're going to take out this next chunk. We're going to take out the Stanislaus again. We're going to take out the Yuba.
Yeah, every one of these areas that hasn't seen fire in the last 20 to 30 years is probably going to burn in the next 5 to 10.
Well,
that's what we're seeing, is that the weather has shifted. The potential for unstoppable fires is growing, and all of these areas that haven't seen fire are incredibly susceptible to that.
Yeah.
We've seen it play out in the Klamath.
Yeah, and it's the big east wind here that blew the Bear Fire.
Can you go to the Slater Fire? Because I think that's one of the most amazing examples of recent wildfires, that basically saved the town of Crescent City.
Okay. Here's Slater.
In that first 24-hour burn period, that was a direct east wind, 50 mile an hour sustained wind for approximately 24 hours with 3% humidity. Mm-hmm. It was blowing directly into that Natchez fire footprint from 2018 that you see there that fits like a puzzle piece.
Yeah.
And the Oak Fire to the south. So a friend of mine, Lee Tarnay, modeled this fire and showed that if it wasn't for those two fire footprints, that fire would have burned all the way to the ocean and burned down the community of Crescent City.
Yeah.
In that first 24-hour period.
Well, I think it's interesting. You take, it's so illustrative. You take something like this fire, and then you just grab a polygon from the like Holiday Farm Fire on the Mackenzie River in Oregon, or any of those big fires that happened on the day before that in Oregon, because we had that whole east wind system move down out of Canada, and it raised hell all the way down through Oregon, tore out like 400,000 acre fires, and then it got to us. You got Slater, we got Bear, and and we saw it coming. I watched that thing the night before. I watched these dust storms moving down on the satellite down through eastern Oregon, and it's just like, man, the Bear Fire tomorrow. And then like 10 in the morning, huge column stood up. We all knew, even though it was still 30 miles away, that we knew that was going to Lake Oroville. So you're totally right. Same thing happened here on Dixie. If you look at, Dixie made a big run up from, Humboldt Summit made this big run in a day, right up through the middle of the map here. We had like 30 miles of firing on the ground from, Lake Elmonor Dam all the way down to Butte Meadows was one big firing operation done under this kind of inversion that lasted about a week with some rain. And then the lid came off the pot, firing operation jumped in multiple points across Humboldt Road, and it ran straight up into Lassen Park. Park a couple of days later did a big firing operation to keep the fire from burning out to Red Bluff. But then it got here to the Reading Fire, and the Reading Fire was a managed wildfire in 2012 or 13 that the Park Service lost control of, and it I don't know, it burned. It was a black eye for the Park Service. but it held up Dixie for almost 2 weeks. And
Yeah.
and that fire, the reading fire, it burned from like here to here in like 2 days 10 years earlier. So we know that Dixie would have burned through that in 2 days. And then it would have potentially been well established out towards Bernie, and it could have burned all the way to Redding. We could have, when we got east winds, it could have burned, same thing, all the way down into the valley, burned all this SPI ground, but didn't, because we had this nice high severity boo-boo that the Park Service made for us. And it held up the fire. And while that was happening, that 2 weeks that we weren't having to fight the fire in Bernie, the Caldor fire was burning, we sent a couple thousand firefighters from here down to the Caldor and saved South Lake Tahoe. And during that time, yes, we finished firing down here, and we saved Westwood, and we saved, Clear Creek and Hamilton Branch, and we stopped this part of the fire from burning the Susanville. And so just that one project that 10 years ago was a huge congressional investigation and looking for heads on a pike because we burned some timberland outside the park, that actually ended up saving tens of thousands of acres of commercial timberland. And it ended up helping us save Tahoe and Susanville and Westwood. So I think, this appetite for losses during prescribed burns, like if we look at the landscape scale, one way or another, having more fire, I got to caveat that and say, like, Hermit's Peak, like, that shouldn't have happened, and what I learned from Hermit's Peak is you can't just go do a burn in the middle of 400,000 acres of forest that hasn't had fire for 100 years. You have to think about those consequences, and that we shouldn't, like if we're going to go put some prescribed fire on the ground, talking about landscape scale treatments, like, let's not do it here, right? Like, let's not do it anywhere. Let's do it, here or here.
Yeah, like the Somes project, that entire Somes 5,600 acre Somes project is set to receive prescribed fire. And the beautiful thing is, right now you've got that McCash fire footprint from 2021 and the Hay Press fire footprint directly upslope. So you have a catcher's mitt to keep that fire contained.
Right. And so we're talking about out in here.
Yeah. So most of what that area to the right of the Klamath that you see there is in our project. And so, using fire footprints strategically to reduce the risk of prescribed fire is critical. And I think part of
that's why you're not starting out in here, right?
Yes. And it's not to say that there isn't essential work that needs to be done in those landscapes that are at the highest risk. But perhaps it's in the beginning, it's more, manual mechanical thinning that sets the stage for opportunities during managed wildfires. So I think, what I really want folks to hear is that, number one, in your regards to your comment to Hermit Peak, I think one of the reasons we've been successful through the Klamath Trex prescribed burning is that it's not just one color of jersey and the people that are implementing those burns. We have CAL FIRE looks at our burn plans, Forest Service looks at our burn plans, a tribe looks at our burn plans, other qualified burn bosses. So there's all these opportunities for people to poke holes and to better that burn plan. And then when it comes to implementation, we have a lot of people, a lot of different colored jerseys out there on the ground, also with the implementation side. And so there's just that much more opportunity that we're, not going to have that tunnel vision and seeing it through one person's eyes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what a black eye. I mean, just the whole idea that we're going to shut down the entire burn program for the whole country because of a bad escape in one region. I was up in Quincy recently, and they have all these huge red slash piles in front of the district office in the Mount Huff district, and they can't burn them because there's a national ban on prescribed burning, and that includes burning piles in front of the freaking Forest Service station. And it's just to me, it's just like, that's ridiculous. If we can't burn piles that are like surrounded with like raked pine needles and green grass, like mowed lawn, like it doesn't make any sense at all.
And the absurdity that it applied to the entire Forest Service, right? I mean, we were back in Virginia in the Blue Ridge Mountains, Shenandoah Valley, for the National Fire Learning Network meeting. Yeah, I think it was back in June, and those burn programs out east, they know what they're doing. The conditions with the summer rains and out there, it's like the risk is almost non-existent. The escapes are non-existent or non-consequential. So the fact that we're doing these politically motivated burn suspensions, either nationally or statewide, is definitely something that in my future utopia of fire management, doesn't exist, because fire is inherently a practice of place. It's tied to that specific landscape, and it's a ground up process that's not a top down process. And so right now it's being managed by liability, by fear of fire. And we basically have our hands tied. If you light a prescribed fire, you're risking your career, you're risking your name and your community. But and it, think of all the burnouts during wild suppression actions where towns burned down or houses burned up or we lost whole watersheds, and there's nobody to blame. And so why wouldn't we, all of the incentives are set up to perpetuate the existing system of fire exclusion, because at its base, it treats wildfires like a natural incident. Even though everybody knows the emperor wears no clothes, these are not natural fires. We created this monster from the past century plus of fire exclusion.
I was just going to pull up something. There's this kind of conversation going on around my home territory. This green is Collins Pine Company. And they've taken huge losses. And, in the Dixie Fire, they lost 50,000 acres. And I've talked to every one of their managers in the last 25 years. I did, I kind of started my career with a fire management plan down here in Deer Creek, hence Deer Creek Resources, Deer Creek GIS. And it was just clear then, like they had done all this biomass thinning in the 1990s, and they had all these opportunities to, you can still kind of see it. You can see like where it's a little speckled here, up against, steep, inaccessible old growth. And they had these opportunities to burn thousands of acres. And I was just talking to them, in 1999, like, hey, we really got to get you guys burning. And like, well, the family's not that into it. They don't like the liability. They don't want to do it. And every single one of them I've talked to is just like, if we don't burn, you're not going to have a forest to manage. Like, yeah. And all the family's not into it, liability too much. And then the Moonlight Fire happened. And then those liability concerns became real because Sierra Pacific Industries had bought a sale. Their loggers started the Moonlight Fire, and then they got $100 million fine.
Yeah.
And part of that was because you can go way down a rabbit hole with that. But the unintended consequence of us finding SPI $100 million for their logger starting a fire that burned up a bunch of Forest Service land that was in totally trash condition because of fire exclusion was now, since then, no one wants to burn. There's not a single industrial timber landowner, because now we've got this legal precedent that not only are you responsible for suppression costs, but you're responsible for watershed damage, scenic values, all sorts of lost habitat and everything else. And so
exactly,
huge consequence. But look at this. So like Collins just lost 50,000 acres in Moonlight, and everyone was afraid they're going to go out of business. And so they just bought Shasta forests. But I'm just thinking, like, man, they bought some more dry forest because they need more logs. They're really committed to running their mill, that's great. Collins has been they've been known to be a good steward of their land. But it's like, man, unless they get really aggressive about burning not only this ownership, but the 85,000 acres they just bought, 10 years from now, they're still going to be screwed. They're not going to have a forest, Yeah. And so coming back to your idea of liability, it's like, we really have to talk about the liability of not burning. If you're a corporate land manager, there's got to be a heavy weight to that, because the consequence for them of not burning was they lost 50,000 acres in about 3 days.
or a state or federal land manager, because the reality is that we have to shift the focus from fire ignitions that cause fires to contiguous fuel beds that spawn the fires. And the crazy thing is all the way up into the early 90s, Cal Fire and the Forest Service knew this. They were heavily invested in VMP burns and brush disposal, TSI crews. They were out there treating the fuels. But as the climate changed and we started to see more and more high severity wildfires because of fire exclusion, they basically had to focus all their available resources strictly on fire suppression. And so much of that ability to manage fuels at the landscape scale has gone away. But, when I look at the landscape, I see leaving areas where fire hasn't been for decades or even 100 years and not managing the fuels on that landscape. That is the criminal act. And when I look at the Slater fire footprint and those 200 plus homes that burned and the 2 people that died, the Forest Service has that blood on their hands, and they won't say it. They point to the fact that they did the evacuations, that that they were brave firefighters, and it's true. Firefighters are brave. This isn't about whether or not our fire professionals are doing a great job. It's about the policy that says it's okay to keep fire out of an area for 100 years and set the stage for the type of fires we're seeing today.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is Dixie. One thing I want to talk about a little bit with you is just fire severity. And this is a severity map of the Dixie Fire. And, we're just looking at the big blue octopus of the Dixie. And we're used to kind of seeing these fires in this outline. And we would say, the fire devastated 1 million acres. And it's like, well, that's not very accurate. The fire burned across 1 million acres.
Yeah.
And then within that, we had, a week of cool, still weather, and the fire underburned for, 50,000 acres. And then we had, a week of bad weather, and the fire burned 150,000 acres of high severity. And then it backed for another 50,000 acres. And then we lit a big backfire, and we got 30,000 acres of hot burn. But there's just all this subtlety in there and all this opportunity I see, talking about Collins Pine, we got this big chunk of land here surrounded by underburn and hot burn and now salvage logging. And it's even got dozer lines, right? They already got dozer lines through there. It's like, why don't we use the backside of the dozer line that we used last time? But to me, this is the low hanging fruit. Hey, let's go put fire in this, 15,000 acre chunk, and it's not going anywhere. We could let it burn for, we could light this in September, let it burn, even if it's a dry winter. It's not going anywhere. And the whole landscape, when you start thinking about, we're just looking at the polygons and talking about the opportunities that are created by previous fires. But then you can get more subtle in there and hey, look, we got this high elevation, this red fir here. We got, 5,000 acres here surrounded with the bright red where the fire's not going anywhere. It's the whole landscape is full of these opportunities. And some of it's private, some of it's public, some of it's in between. But the fact is that we're not going to get to a lot of this land, even on the private, to salvage it all. So how can we use fire as these trees fall down? I think one of the problems is that we've got this this management landscape that, the first thing the Forest Service thinks about after a fire like this is, hey, we got to go do hazard tree removal on all Class B roads. And that equals 100,000 acres within a Dixie Fire, or within 300 feet of a, Class 2 Forest Service road. So we draw all these lines, do all this. They're going to okay, we got a categorical exemption for all this. All those roads exist for a management reality that no longer exists. We're not going to grow commercial timber on the Almanor in this area. It's just not happening. But we still have this road system that's built around carting logs to the mill from every square inch of the forest. So we're going to spend all this time clearing this road network, potentially, that no longer really serves its intended purpose, when we could be sending the same crews out to prep roads for a giant burn.
Yeah. I mean, I'm to the point where I think both statewide and nationally, there needs to be agencies whose primary task is delivering good fire to the landscape, because it's clear to me that CAL FIRE and Forest Service are not going to be those agencies. Their focus is clear. They're driven by protecting private property in the case of CAL FIRE, and in the case of the Forest Service, it's delivering logs to the mill. And there's been, there's a lot of talk about ecosystem management, but when it comes down to it and you look at their staff time and where they're told to work, it's on, preparing salvage sales, it's on preparing hazard tree sales. It's not on the offense, the proactive projects, and that's not across the board. There's some great people in the Forest Service. There's some great people in CAL FIRE that are trying to do good things, but the system currently doesn't support those people to do the good things. And so, I think what we're seeing is every time a town burns down, like Greenville or Paradise, it forces us to question what's happening. And the more people that watch your show, the more people that come and burn with us during a treks, the more people that get to see these alternative ways of managing fire that make a lot more sense, even with the constraints we have today with liability. It just makes sense. We got to lean into these recent fire footprints, not to extract the last remaining merchantable logs. That's kind of like, mugging the burn victim, but leaning in the sense of we owe a debt to this landscape to restore fire process there. And this is our opportunity. All the fuels are reduced.
Yeah, I see this around Greenville, especially. Here's Greenville. Fire went right down Main Street and tore out that whole community. But then you've got this whole south-facing slope of Ketty Ridge that goes from 3,000 feet or 3,500 up to 6,500 feet, where we could put fire in this whole spot. We got this opportunity right now. There's been a lot of thinning done around people's homes at the bottom. And if we don't do that, all these trees in these mixed severity areas are going to fall down. And 10, 15 years from now, we're going to have a fire. And all the rest of the green teas we can see from Indian Valley are going to be dead too.
Yeah.
And one thing that came up for me with that is like in the moonlight, right over the top here, here's moonlight. Like there's some green islands left in moonlight, but there were more green islands before the Dixie in the moonlight fire than there are now. There were a lot of places out here where some big trees survived 2007 fire, with a lot of small trees killed underneath. And then Dixie came through and nuked a lot of those remaining stands because we didn't make it a priority to go into the burn and do some work on the green trees in the burn to get some fire into this landscape when we had a chance. So to me, that's the big failure. It's like, if I look at the landscape right now, it's kind of hard not to have this grief that the forest that's green right now, 20 years from now won't be, because we're not going to get into it. And all those trees that are in the understory that got killed are going to fall down, and we're going to just have fuel loads that take this out on the next round.
Yeah. And the sad truth that we've seen here on the Salmon River, our first high severity mega fire was the 1977 hog fire. And, the reality is that, a lot of that area was helicopter logged. The slash was left on the ground. And the subsequent 1987 fire that burned through those landscapes, like you see where the Cronin fire was on the North Fork there, that area all burned in the 77 fire and the 87 fire, and then several subsequent fires. But so much of that area that used to be able to support forest just simply can't support forest anymore, because in some places it's lost 8 feet of topsoil, and you can see it there on all those drainages, Big Creek, China Creek, Olson. There was places that 6, 7 feet, 8 feet of topsoil just ran down into the river and completely hosed the spring Chinook refugia below our house where I grew up. And so, we're causing problems that is going to take thousands and thousands, if not tens of thousands of years of soil formation to get back to where we were, 30 years ago.
Yes, sir.
So we were talking about this, bold new ideas theme, and here we are just, rehashing how screwed we are in the current system. So I don't know how
Well, I
much time
think,
we have left,
yeah.
but maybe we
Well, I
should
think
talk
yeah,
about.
I think the bold new ideas thing comes back to seizing these opportunities in the burn scars to put fire on the ground at a large scale and not messing around with 20 acres, 50 acres, 100 acres. Like, I mean, unless we're getting fire on the ground, 10,000 acres, 100,000 acres, like we're just, I think for me, it's this conversation about control and about admitting when you're beat, and that for me, watching the Dixie Fire and seeing my friends in Cal Fire, just getting their asses kicked for 6 weeks straight. It's like, let's have that conversation. No one wants to talk about all the ways that we failed, how much work we put into a fire that ended up being 1,000,000 acres, but let's have that conversation and let's talk about that, about like, hey, this isn't working, people. So it's like, let's have that conversation about losing, and let's have that conversation about letting go of control, that, hey, if we put fire on the ground for 100,000 acres, there's going to be days that it really kicks ass and puts up a column that you can see from space. And that's not what I hope happens, but like to get to the scale when we're putting fire on the ground and it's burning for months, there's going to be days that you burn a watershed, you burn a couple thousand acres, but we can't let the fact that we don't have the control keep us from putting fire on the ground at that scale.
Well, I feel I totally agree with all that. And I think we're only going to get there if we develop mechanisms for shared risk management. And that was the whole purpose for developing the strategic fuel breaks that are outlined in that pods layer, which is actually online right now. People can look at that North Coast Resource Partnership website and comment on it's basically crowdsourcing where are the best places, not only to manage wildfires from, but also to implement larger scale prescribed burns as we get closer to the front country. And when you start to do more detailed state and transition modeling for those areas of how fire on fire interactions work and how fire is going to burn at specific times, you can start to quantify, through suppression difficulty index, the percentages that you're going to have negative effects. And so then that becomes a conversation tool between the communities that are affected by these fire managers' decisions about, whether to put out a fire or let it burn to 5,000 or 50,000 acres. And then we can make those decisions together. People see that, yes, we're all agreeing that we're going to take this 5% risk that we could get a freak wind event, and this beneficial managed wildfire or larger scale prescribed burn is going to have some impacts. But let's look at transparent eyes, and what is that going to do if that same area burns in August or September, and there's
Right.
a 95% chance that we're going to lose a part of our town. And so when we can start to have shared risk conversation and making those decisions together, not where it's just one agency, but it's the affected communities, it's the tribes, it's the state, it's the feds all agreeing together to take that risk, that's when we're going to succeed at starting to use fire at scale.
Yeah, I agree with you there. And just going out and doing some burn bossing on these landowner burns around Forest Ranch, and feeling firsthand that exposure to the risk. It's like, why is this all on me? Collectively, we made this decisions to put out all the fires that created this massive problem. We've socially caused problem, but then it comes down to the private individual who lights the prescribed burn. It's on the hook for all that, and I just really felt it. And then also realized that, we had a couple close calls with vehicles, people backing into things, or someone riding in the back of the truck, and realizing that it was very likely going to be like an accident that had nothing to do with fire that would ruin your burn or that would kill someone.
Yeah.
And just that, so sharing the responsibility for, owning the fact, we had a firefighter die on a prescribed burn this year, got hit by a snag during prep, and just brought home that idea that this is dangerous work. People who are doing it need to be treated as heroes, just like firefighters do, because they're facing all the same risks. in addition to the risk of liability, which you never face as an IC on a fire when you decide to put the fire out.
Exactly. And that just brings us back to, the difference between Marshall Tuberville and our meeting with CAL FIRE in Wairika, where, the Bernie Paul, who was the ex Siskiyou unit chief, who's now the head of the volunteer departments in Siskiyou County, was there. And he's like, man, what more do you want from us? We put out 98% of the fires. And Chris Dunn put up this map that showed the success at putting out fires over the past 60 years. And then it looked at the acres burned, and so the success at putting out fires was hanging strong at 98%, but the acres burned was just going through the roof in this enormous J curve. And so, I think where we'll have arrived is that, CAL FIRE as an organization will have that realization, like Marshall Tuberville did, that we have to embrace fire on the landscape, that, continuously putting out fires at very small acreage in those times of year when they're doing ecological good and creating that mosaic is not a viable strategy in this climate on this landscape.
Well, and I think just coming back to opportunities created by fire is we've got people in Horse Creek evacuated right now for a week while fire slowly backs down to their place. Got a 2014 burn scar here, 2016 burn scar here. It's like, and we got a bunch of new dozer line right here. It's like, hey, how about we try to burn this in the next year or two? You got this window. It's like, so to bring that back home, what opportunities are these fires right now creating? Can we come in here and burn this south part of Mill Creek that's not getting burned? And there's this huge hesitancy, I think, on kind of government officials' parts to traumatize people. So yeah, we've got this opportunity after the campfire to come and burn right around Magalia, but we're not going to do it because people are traumatized by smoke and are traumatized by flames.
Well, give them agency in that decision. That's what I've found, is that the perception by the state and federal fire management agencies that the public isn't supportive is just that. It's a perception. And so after the 2021 or the 2020 Slater fire, I was told by both CAL FIRE and the Forest Service that, maybe now wasn't a good time to do the treks, and put fire on the ground, prescribed fire. And so the wildfires were still going on. And I went to the public meeting where, all the agencies are up front talking, and they asked a question and they were allowing questions. And for my question, I turned to the audience. I was like, I want to ask the community this question. There's like 150 people in the bleachers at the Happy Camp football field at the high school there. What do you guys feel about us doing prescribed fire this fall, right after the Slater fire, right after all these homes were lost? And there was very clear, almost unanimous support for putting fire on the ground. People get it. They understand that we can do prescribed fire in a good way. And so it's really, I think, the agencies that need to take, the initiative, and the politicians. And that's what I said at the governor's task force in May. What we need right now is a level of political bravery with our fire managers and with our politicians, because, politicians work on very short time frames, and fire policy does not work on short time frames. We need to take that long-term vision and assume risk, but don't assume risk as a hero like they've been trained to do. Assume risk together with these communities and be transparent about those risks. And let's make those decisions together about when and where and why to use fires and where to put fires out.
Yeah. Someone was asking about how often we lose burns.
Yeah, I mean, we've done over 300 burns in over the past 22 years and haven't lost one. But that's not to say that we aren't going to lose one. If you're doing good work out there, you're eventually going to lose one. I think, we just need to create that space and take that risk together.
Yeah, I hear you on the risk. And when I was talking about like thinking big and realizing we're going to lose big, I'm I don't want to, I don't want people to think that I just think we should just go light it all on fire and be good with high severity outcomes. But I do think that we have to surrender to some semblance of control when we manage fire, because managing fire is oxymoron. Like fire is going to do what it wants. And especially when we've got such a high proportion of our landscape in this extremely unhealthy condition.
The patient has stage 4 cancer. The treatment doesn't look pretty.
Well, I'm just looking at the land that just burned. I'm going to jump back in the map for a minute because I can't help myself. Anyway, so yeah, McKinney started down here and it ran this whole drainage pretty much in a couple hours. And we talked in the lookout about fire behavior and clear cuts. And I'm going to do a little field trip. I got some foresters yelling at me about what I say about fires burning and clear cuts, but it's based on things I've seen. It's not based on something I learned in a PhD program or something. Not to say that PhDs don't know what's going on, but just talking about fires running up through these hot, dry plantations, spotting the next one and onward. It's like there's a reason that the fire ran 25,000 acres in the first day, and it has a lot to do with the management history here. I feel like in a lot of ways that these landowners are kind of screwed, in just that there's that checkerboard when every other section is owned by the feds or the private timber landowners. Like, what are you going to do? How are you going to, if I'm a private timber landowner and I decide I do want to burn, what am I supposed to, like, chop a line across the head of this gully and like hold my fire there because
Well,
the
this
feds
is
might not
where
get on board?
partnerships are essential. To make progress at the landscape scale, you need to have strong partnerships, and those start with shared values, like we started the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership. Because I think you're working with some of these timber companies. People within those companies get it, and if we can solve the liability problems for them,
Mm-hmm.
they're going to embrace landscape scale fuels treatments that go across ownerships from public to private, and make sense on the landscape. And it's not going to happen tomorrow.
Well, and you're working with the Forest Service on it. I don't even know where to start with the Forest Service, because I feel like they're not getting anything done when it comes to, we can talk all day about large scale projects, but it's like
they're not getting anything done here, Zeke. I think, the more I talk to folks across the country and tour projects in the Southeast, and some of the stuff they're doing in Idaho and Colorado, there are places where the Forest Service is starting to act at that landscape scale and has been managing fires in some of those wilderness areas. I think we need to elevate those voices of the people within the agencies that are showing that model can work. And right now it all comes down to, who is out in the media and perpetuating those stories. And unfortunately, Region 5 Forest Service in California has been, very fire averse in the terms of proactive fire for a long time. And that's part of our culture within the Forest Service. And so we have a harder hand dealt us to change that local culture. And it's going to take, working at the national level as well as the local and the state levels to create that shared vision for how we want to change that.
Sounds pretty boring.
Believe me, it's not what I like to do, but that's how we make change, right? That's how we get all this gray hair.
I hope so. I'm sick of planning. I've been planning my whole career, and like shit just keeps getting worse.
Well, we also burn together, right? And earlier you said I don't care about those 20 and 30 acre burns, and I would beg to differ and say that it's the trust. It's the practice of burning that we learn at those smaller scales. That's what's going to allow us to burn at those larger scales successfully. We're relearning that art of burning. And these recent wildfire footprints are offering us an opportunity to go big. And I think, hopefully, the people that start to understand how fire is operating at the landscape and the state and federal agencies are willing to go there with us, because it's our last best hope for saving some of our communities and saving some of the forests and saving our rivers. it's looking bleak out there, and we need to try something new.
Yeah.
And I
All
got to
right.
get my ass out of here.
Yeah, go play some volleyball.
Yeah. Well, so great to talk to you, Zeke. And I look forward to the next time we get to sit down and talk about something.
Thanks, Will.
We'll keep it.
Yeah, good luck
Yeah.
with the next month or so.
Absolutely. And keep it up, Zeke. I love what you're doing on the show. And I think it's so important. And
All right, I'm glad I caught you.
So proud.
All right. See you, buddy.
See ya.
Bye.
I have seen the fire next time. Let me burn. We don't have long to get this right. Let me burn. I have listened long enough to feel the balance of fire on this land. Let me burn through the day and through the night. Let me burn under direction of medicine men and Thukin fire woman. Let me burn to prepare for the return of fire ceremonies. Let me burn at the right time without compliance or permits. Show me first the permit for a century of genocide and fire exclusion. Let me burn. The fish are dying. People are dying. The land is sick. Let us burn. Only together. Let us burn. We are tired of endless summers of black sun. Let us burn. Only the good fire can keep the black soot from our lungs. Let us burn in all but the birthing moons. This fire is medicine, and the patient is sick. Let us burn with a fire that prunes and clears where the brush is thick. Let us burn with a torch that's guided by the fire stick. Let us burn together. Let our fire reconnect us to this land. Let us burn. Democrats and Republicans, let us burn together. Native people and cattlemen, let us burn and be fed from the fruits of our labors. Let us burn together to protect our friends and our neighbors. Let us burn before it's too late. Oh, so much loss. My soul is sick. The smoke comes in again thick. The ceremonies can't wait. Now is the time as we enter the new year. They set fire to the spirit mountain. It singes the maiden's hair. The promise of rebirth. Let them burn like they have for more than 10,000 years. Let us burn together. I am tired of living in fear. The time is now. No joke. Change how we live with fire, or watch all we love go up in smoke.
Yeah.